Star Wars has always been an IP about the hero's journey, the original story culminating in love and hope, bringing about an impossible redemption. But as we've discussed before, the story of Vader was not one that originally ended in salvation. Ever since the iconic moment that Vader yeeted his boss, the Star Wars franchise has been seemingly obsessed with the idea of redemption, with redefining evil characters into something with which the audience can more easily empathize. But I'm beginning to wonder if the cliché redemption arc has gone too far. In this video essay, we'll explore how the franchise has consistently been humanizing Star Wars villains. We'll examine the characters as they were introduced, compared to how they are portrayed in the media now. We'll see if we can figure out the why behind these decisions. Why is the franchise, and Disney in particular, so seemingly obsessed with redefining evil? And lastly, we'll take what we've discussed here and see what lessons we can apply to improve our own lives. Hello everyone, Darth here, and welcome back again to another overly analytical video essay. The idea prompting this video popped suddenly into my head during this scene of Book of Boba Fett. When we see a monster in a movie, we typically see a mindless beast that needs to be defeated. And in the original trilogy, the Rancor was the ultimate monster. Humongous, ravenous, and able to easily swallow even your mama in one bite. It emerges from deep shadow, at first only its bright eyes visible. The dancer is screaming and terrified, the Gamorrean guard was screaming and terrified, even Luke Skywalker, powerful Jedi Knight, was stoically terrified. Because of the creature's size, its beautiful design, and the dark tone of the scene, this creature would go down in Star Wars history as one of the coolest mini-bosses of all time. Which leads us to the Book of Boba Fett. Boba is gifted a baby Rancor as a gift, and our entire perception of this creature is put to the test. The trainer tells us that Rancors are actually quite peaceful, unless threatened, that they imprint themselves on the first human they set eyes on, and are extremely loyal and very loving. Now, yes, we did get hints that these creatures have a softer side, as Episode 6 showed us the caretaker breaking down in tears when he saw his pet friend killed. But for the most part, I'd consider this the first solid example of redefining a two-dimensional creature so that it is no longer a villain, merely misunderstood. Next up, let's look at the merciless mercenary Boba Fett. In the original trilogy, Fett is a ruthless bounty hunter looking for a payoff with the capture of Han Solo. His renown was instantly cemented, as Vader singled him out from the group. Fett was also shown to be quite smart, being the only person to figure out the Falcon was hiding in the space debris, and tracking them all the way to Cloud City without being spotted. Beyond these short scenes though, the films give us nothing. Boba is a mercenary for hire. We never see his face, he speaks little, and we have no idea what kind of personality he actually has. Besides wanting money and having no disillusions about working with the Empire for his financial benefit. Boba's original story ends in Return of the Jedi, as the once epic warrior suddenly has a Three Stooges moment and falls to his apparent death in the Sarlacc pit. As a brief explanation of story crafting, as we discussed in the Kylo Ren video, there are different villain archetypes that writers use for different reasons. Bucky the Winter Soldier was written to give the audience mixed feelings. He's a character that we want to be redeemed because we see his suffering and know what he was like before he fell. By contrast, Killmonger is a straight-up main villain. He has few qualities with which the audience wants to empathize, and even knowing his rough backstory doesn't really change our perception of him. And thirdly, you'll have villains such as Taskmaster, forces of evil used by the main villain who have no personality or story of their own. This is who Boba Fett was written to be. Like Maul or Grievous, Boba Fett was written as nothing more than a two-dimensional villain, evil and needing no further explanation. Fast forward 30 years, and we see Disney surprise fans canonizing the Legends story of Fett surviving the Sarlacc pit. As the show progresses, fans get to know what kind of man Boba Fett really is. And it turns out he's very kind, generous, loyal, honest. I have a difficult time even classifying this character as an anti-hero. He styles himself a crime lord but rarely does anything remotely villainous. He only kills criminals, only fights those who won't negotiate. This is a totally different character than the one Vader had to explicitly forbid from disintegrating people. This character was utterly redefined, from a two-dimensional, stereotypical low-level villain to a complex and cutthroat hero. Now, yes, maybe one could argue the entire point of the Book of Boba Fett was showing us his transformation from villain to hero, and how his time with the Sand People changed him for the better. But I would argue that this interpretation is not well supported by the text, and is mainly audience conjecture, an attempt to reach cognitive closure in our understanding of Fett's abrupt change. George Lucas originally portrayed the Sand People as dangerous indigenous people of Tatooine. We know nothing of their history, their culture, or why they so aggressively attack Luke. Fast forward to 1999, and we see them on screen again, taking pot shots at pod racers. Next, we meet the Tuskens in 2002's Attack of the Clones, as Anakin tracks down the group that captured and killed his mother. In the original 6 films, we're able to get a tiny glimpse into the minds of these creatures. We see that they are barbaric and violent towards outsiders, but intelligent, traveling in single file to hide their numbers. We also see that they are likely domestic, numerous families living together in their own houses, forming a little community. Despite the inferences we can make about their domestication, the Sand People were clearly written as two-dimensional villains. They were the indigenous culture, the savage Indians of the pioneer days, personified in an alien world. And for the third time, the Book of Boba Fett utterly recontextualizes these villains into something very, very different. We see their culture, we see their families, we see that although they are cutthroat and heartless towards other species, they are willing to accept you as one of their own, if you're able to prove yourself worthy. We see that just like the Native Americans, the Tuskens' native land has been taken away from them by outsiders, and we see an entire village slaughtered just to prove a point. Audiences finish the Book of Boba Fett viewing the Tuskens in a drastically different light. No longer are they mindless killers or mere plot devices. Now they are a warrior culture, one that our protagonist sees as family. Black Chrysanthemum is a Wookiee bounty hunter and was introduced in the Book of Boba Fett as a firmly established villain that our characters knew and feared. Black K takes on Boba, the augmented Techno-Teens, and 2 Gamorrean guards, and for the most part outclasses all of them combined. An utter force of nature, Black K was introduced to the show as a deadly villain, dead set on deading everyone and everything. Only the show makes it a point to tell us he's not really evil. He's been a slave for years, having to fight as a gladiator just to survive, having to work as a bounty hunter and be loyal to whomever currently owns him. By the end of the show, Black Chrysanthemum has totally flipped sides, another evil character who wasn't really evil, just controlled by evil people. In the original trilogy, Jabba the Hutt is the Don of the Hutt family. He is the crime lord and shows his total control in how callously he'll doom you to the horrific death of being eaten alive. Now, there's a good bit of difference between the more comical Jabba we see in A New Hope and the crueler version we see in Return of the Jedi. But I would say that it's his later rendition that audience members would consider canon. We think of Jabba as the heartless evil crime lord that cares about no one and nothing. Enter the 2008 Clone Wars movie. Jabba's son gets kidnapped, and throughout the course of the story, Jabba is somewhat de-villainized, as his obvious love for his son transforms our perception of him. From that of a pure villain into someone who may just be trying to provide for his family in the best way he knows how. Kylo was written as Vader 2.0, only this time the main villain was seemingly designed around the idea of redemption. The story constantly prompts the audience to question whether Kylo will leave Snoke and go back with his father, or abandon the First Order to be with Rey. In fact, I'm not sure I've ever seen another character where the audience was more obsessed with speculating over his future. The story makes it fairly obvious that Rey would become a Jedi, and according to the story we're given, it seemed obvious that Kylo would continually be her nemesis. But it doesn't matter how many people Kylo straight up murders, because Vader was redeemed, and because Kylo comes from an iconic, beloved family, the audience wants to see his redemption. Episode 8 is obsessed with humanizing Kylo, with showing the audience that he's a tortured soul who knows he's a monster, but also knows it's not his fault, that his entire life was ruined by his own uncle who was supposed to love him. If you delve into the books, you'll see that Snoke was manipulating Kylo towards the dark side while he was still an unborn baby. Kylo's entire character arc is built around humanizing the villain. The films show us a jaded, narcissistic interpretation of evil, where the villain is only a villain because of the decisions other people made, and nothing he does is his fault. When young Han gets captured and thrown into this pit, we're treated with a rather horrific scene, as it's quickly made clear that just like with the Rancor, this pit contains a monster, kept trapped, starving in a filthy pit, and it's about to slowly eat Han alive. Now, whether or not this is some random Wookiee or Chewbacca himself, that doesn't really matter. The point is, this is yet another bad guy that our protagonist has to fight only to find out they're not really a villain at all. The Rancor in the pit wasn't evil, it was just hungry, and Luke was its shot at dinner. Chewie wasn't evil, he just hadn't eaten in 3 days. And going even further into that story, Solo's entire plot basically revolved around the idea of humanizing the villain, as we spent an entire movie getting to see the vulnerabilities of characters that never had any intention of doing the right thing. When we're introduced to Andor in Rogue One, he literally murders an innocent guy who was trying to help him. But he's not really a bad guy, he had to do it for the rebellion. The Techno-Teens weren't actually criminals, as Boba had been told. They were being grifted and needed to steal to survive. The garbage monster wasn't really trying to eat Luke. She wasn't truly evil, she was just baptizing him. Asajj Ventress, one of the most outright villainous, heartless characters in the entire franchise, is just a heartbroken student who had to watch her beloved master die in front of her. The books tell us that Count Dooku isn't nearly as evil as the films or Clone Wars series depict him to be, but that he was a devout believer in their cause and honestly thought that the Separatists could run the galaxy better than the Republic. Savage Opress didn't murder Jedi because he was evil. He was brainwashed and only ever in that position because he loved his younger brother, whom he was then forced to murder with his bare hands. The clones weren't heartless villains who betrayed their Jedi commanders. They all had chips implanted in their brains that compelled them to obey orders. And finally, there's Anakin Skywalker himself. The way that the prequels built up his character arc absolutely humanized the villain that he would become. Now we look at Vader and we see Shmi dying in his arms. We see how deeply losing his mother wounded him, and how he would do anything to keep from losing Padme, too. We see how Palpatine twists Anakin's fear until the young man tries to murder the very woman he was terrified of losing. The prequels could have been written utilizing a very different version of Anakin Skywalker. He could have been a complete jerk, unbelievably cocky, arrogant, and rude.
Anakin. What? He was gonna blow up the ship.
I mean, like, even worse than he was shown in the Clone Wars. He could have been written as someone the audience didn't even want to empathize with, so that he had very little transition from hero to villain. But the prequels make it a point to show us that it was mainly the circumstances that led to Anakin's turn. Just like all those previous examples, so many of these villains are not villains because they chose to be. They are only seen as evil because they're misunderstood, or because someone truly evil was controlling them. Not only is Star Wars seemingly obsessed with humanizing the villain, but the franchise is also consumed by the rather toxic mindset that nothing is ever your fault. In this article from Psychology Today, author Kim Schneiderman discusses this concept of passing on the blame so that no poor decision you make is actually your fault. She points out how the blame game is part of our earliest history. Adam blaming Eve for the apple, Eve blaming the serpent, neither of them taking responsibility for doing what they knew was wrong. Be it legend or fact, either way, we've all grown up hearing the story of how the literal first humans ever played the blame game and refused to be held accountable for their own actions. Schneiderman describes the psychology, the why, that explains our extreme aversion to accepting blame. She says that we equate being wrong with being bad, unlovable, or unworthy. That our mistake is somehow seen as a reflection of our morals or self-worth. She describes how we don't want to risk being vulnerable and don't want to have to change. And that's exactly what being proven wrong mandates should happen. For many, many years, I firmly and aggressively proclaimed that sushi was the single most disgusting culinary creation on the entire planet. I nearly threw up the first time I tried it, and stoically refused to even look at the stuff again for a literal decade. And guess what? Sushi is delicious. Occam's razor would suggest I had the misfortune of long ago getting the one rotten piece out of the plate our table shared. And in order for me to overcome this aversion, in order for me to defeat this fear, I had to be willing to admit I was wrong. I had to be vulnerable to my friends and say, "You're right, sushi rocks. I wish I tried it again years ago." I had to force myself to alter my deeply held belief, had to get past my mind's natural barriers that innately try to prevent me from changing. Recall any time you've been decisively proven wrong, and you'll understand the feelings Schneiderman is describing here. I was ashamed to have been so wrong about a delicious food for so many years. My first inclination was to shift the blame, say it's my brother's fault for handing me that first poisoned piece that ruined my next decade of sushiing, or blame my friends for not trying hard enough to get me to try it again. I innately wanted to do anything and everything other than blame myself and my own stubbornness for the past decade of lost deliciousness. We've been taught to blame and know no other way. Schneiderman says, simply put, blame feels better than guilt. If you're not at fault, you didn't make a mistake. And if you didn't make a mistake, you're not bad. And if you're not bad, you don't need to change, which can be scary and difficult. And if you don't need to change, the other person does, so you're off the hook. Our inherent need to blame others for our mistakes stems from our own internal view of self-worth. We all know people who have no problem whatsoever with admitting when they were wrong about something. These people are entirely flexible, willing to be proven wrong, willing to learn and grow, grateful to be corrected, and completely unashamed about their ignorance. And on the other hand, we all know people who never take the blame for anything. Every mistake they make is someone else's fault. They never learn, never grow, and are steadfastly stubborn about refusing to accept accountability. I suspect that the difference in these types of personalities derives from each individual's sense of self-worth. Because if you know who you are and like who you are more open-minded to self-examination. You are more open to acknowledging your own faults and are open-minded enough to explore the possibility of change. Don't ruin sushi for yourself. If you find your finger pointing in blame at someone else, guess what? It probably needs to be pointed in the opposite direction. Because you are the problem. And that doesn't mean that you are evil or lazy or stupid. Let yourself feel vulnerable, accept that you are wrong, and see that your character arc has just taken a step forward, all because you were willing to admit your mistake and embrace change. Now, one thing the article is quick to clarify is that, yes, it's absolutely true that sometimes it really wasn't your fault. Sometimes bad things happen to you, and you legitimately didn't make a poor decision that led you down the wrong path. It's not Anakin's fault that Palpatine manipulated him. It's not Anakin's fault that the Tuskens kidnapped, tortured, and murdered his mother. It's not Anakin's fault that the Jedi Council didn't trust him because of his relationship with Palpatine. But murdering Dooku in cold blood absolutely was Anakin's fault. Murdering the entire village of Sand People was Anakin's fault. Looking at a group of children begging for help and killing them was his conscious decision. Letting his anger control him and choking his pregnant wife was his fault, and trying to shift the blame over to Obi-Wan was his fault. When I started writing this script, the idea was entirely centered around the concept of humanizing the villain, and how shows like the Book of Boba Fett have been redefining what we perceive evil to be. But now I seem to have uncovered a deeper, darker truth that seems to have always existed in the background of the Star Wars franchise. This world seems to revolve around a lack of responsibility. It's a fairly consistent theme that nothing is ever anyone's fault.
It wasn't my fault, really. So Boba flashed me with his vids.
Malfunctioning little twerp. This is all his fault. He tricked me into going this way, but he'll do no... I think I'm melting. This is all your fault. It wasn't my fault, sir. Please don't deactivate me. I told him not to go, but he's faulty, malfunctioning.
Hey, Jabba. Look, Jabba, I was just on my way to pay you back, and I got a little sidetracked. It's not my fault.
I lost control.
It wasn't your fault.
No light speed.
It's not my fault.
It's all Obi-Wan's fault. He's jealous. He's holding me back.
How come every time you fly, we crash?
It's not my fault, it's the ship!
You turned her against me!
You have done that yourself!
The seemingly central theme of redemption is beginning to make a bit more sense, as we also find a consistent theme of characters portraying low self-esteem, who refuse to accept responsibility for their actions. Refusing to accept blame is so deeply ingrained in all of us that I think the audience may subconsciously pick up on these lines, and since we don't want these characters to be wrong, we start looking for explanations that lead to redemption.
I trusted the It's not my fault!
Did your men deactivate the hyperdrive on the Millennium Falcon?
Yes, my lord.
Good.
Now we feel absolved. We were stressed out thinking that Lando was wrong, imagining his humiliation, but it really wasn't his fault. Movies can be formulaic, and many studios will stick with a familiar outline, usually because that's also the most profitable. Look in nearly any genre and you'll find characters shifting the blame onto someone else, mandating a subsequent redemptive act where that blame is resolved with the original perpetrator finally admitting their guilt.
Sorry. I'm a piping hot mess. Nothing's been the same since New York. You experience things, and then they're over and you still can't explain them. Gods, aliens, other dimensions, I'm just a man in a can.
This exploration was the psychological why behind the numerous redemption arcs that seem to humanize a villain for no particular reason. But what I'm not able to figure out is, why is this specifically a Star Wars-centric problem? Many fans are upset over the new meanings given to characters they grew up with, and I think most blame Disney for the changes made to these characters. But if anything, I would argue that Disney has a history of writing far more stereotypical villains for their stories. When you look at villains in classic Disney movies, in general, they're the flat, two-dimensional, pure evil type of villain. In Who Framed Roger Rabbit, the character of Judge Doom is an all-out evil man with no redeeming qualities. Scar, the antagonist in The Lion King, is ranked as one of the best villains ever and is just straight-up evil. In Mulan, Shan Yu wants to destroy everything the Chinese Empire has built and is as vile a character as you can get. Cruella de Vil, Ursula, Jafar, Hades, Gaston, nearly every single villain that you look at in the popular Disney repertoire is the straightforward main villain archetype. No redeeming qualities, no humanization, no redemption. Given all those examples, I'm not sure we can say that it's purely the Disney era of Star Wars that's responsible for these changes to older Star Wars characters. This seems to me to be a Lucasfilm mindset, or possibly a fan base mindset that Lucasfilm continues to embrace. Maybe it's really us fans who are obsessed with the idea that nothing is our fault, that maybe one day we'll get our own redemption arc that will prove we were never in the wrong to begin with. Maybe we love redemption arcs because we hate being vulnerable, because we want to prove that sushi is disgusting, that we were right all along. Maybe we love Star Wars because we hate ourselves. And when we saw that heartless, despicable Vader could be redeemed, then maybe we have a chance too. Speculation about our reasoning aside, there are some notable exceptions to this discussion I want to be sure to point out. Because what I'm primarily talking about is the characters that are redefined completely out of the blue. There was no character arc to the Rancor. A baby just showed up literally on Boba's doorstep, and we get the forced exposition that these creatures aren't really evil. As we explored extensively in the Kylo Ren video, there was next to nothing in his character arc that verifiably led the audience towards his redemption. One minute he was trying to straight up murder Rey, and the next minute he was a good guy again. Now, the Sand People, admittedly, had a bit more of an arc to their recontextualization. When they first capture Boba, they're as brutal towards him as I imagine they were towards Shmi Skywalker. We gradually see them gain respect for Boba and accept him as one of their own. Redefining villains in this manner is, in general, an extremely good thing. This slow, methodical change shows us the writers giving proper time and effort in their story crafting, so that this character development feels natural to the audience. In Star Wars Rebels, their nemesis, Agent Kallus, relentlessly pursues the Ghost crew, and we see his change of heart, not suddenly out of left field, but slowly, developing as a result of being stranded with Zeb, seeing the love the Rebels had for one another and how no one in the entire Empire actually cared about him. And for the absolute best example of humanizing the villain done properly, we need look no further than my favorite character who first made me fall in love with the franchise. Through the Clone Wars and Rebels TV series, we see Maul struggle with how much the Sith had taken from him. We see how his defeat at the hands of young Obi-Wan physically and mentally broke him, leading him to question everything he knew to be true. The writers take us on a journey, taking this two-dimensional, literally throwaway villain and molding him into a complex, tragic character that the audience can understand. And when he finally dies, cradled in Obi-Wan's arms, it's an extremely heartfelt moment for the audience, because this is no longer a nameless, faceless conduit for evil. Maul has become a person, and has the closest thing to a redemption arc that makes sense for someone with his backstory. It was pretty cool learning more about the Sand People and how their culture functions. It was awesome seeing Boba ride his Rancor into battle. Having Black K join their side felt epic. Seeing Ben Solo gain control over his life again did feel gratifying to see. But we didn't need to redefine these villains. Their stories worked just fine as two-dimensional instruments of evil. But the Star Wars franchise seems consistently intent on shifting the blame, on avoiding accountability. No one is really evil. They're all just misunderstood, working towards their own contrived, unnecessary redemption arc. Stories of old were almost always about the standard hero's journey. Now we have popular stories like Joker and/or Watchmen, Stories that deviate from conventionally acceptable standards and allow the audience to question their own perception of morality. My theory was that this shift is possible in part because audiences today are far better educated, capable of understanding more nuance than back in the Middle Ages when only the elite could read, and all the stories were of noble knights defeating evil dragons. My podcast cohorts, David and Rybold, both disagreed with that theory and think what I'm describing is more likely the current socially accepted morality code, which has grown much wider than it used to be. Whatever the case, one of Star Wars' most profound bits of dialogue is centered around the insight that our perspectives are all very different.
Luke, you're going to find that many of the truths we cling to depend greatly on our own point of view.
And the modern era of film has absolutely been all about the hero. The protagonist's point of view has dominated the plots of movies for generations, where the focus is on the hero and their journey, with the usually generic villain being an obstacle standing in the way. But for the most part, this personification of evil does a disservice to the audience. It is entirely unrealistic to have an antagonistic force of pure evil. Palpatine didn't solely inspire loyalty out of fear. He rewarded people, made them rich, promoted them, kept them in power. Thanos was capable of murdering his beloved daughter, but honestly believed he was making the best decision to help the entire universe. Severus Snape wasn't really a Death Eater who murdered the kindest, coolest granddad ever. It was all done in memory of a woman he loved. Grand Admiral Thrawn, as described in the books at least, was not at all a villain. He was kind-hearted, honest, trustworthy, and doing the best he could to protect his people and the galaxy at large. A lot of us who have been lifetime fans of the franchise have been very, very dissatisfied since Disney took over. But if we can bring ourselves to put down our pitchforks and look at the bigger picture, Star Wars making these changes to these characters is probably ultimately a good thing, because it shows an evolution in the broader understanding of stories and of what true character complexity really means. Yes, there probably should always be characters written as pure villains, as that archetype of evil will always be useful in certain situations. The inheritance cycle, for instance, required both types of villain. Galbatorix was the two-dimensional pure force of evil, and Murtagh was the tortured villain brainwashed to be evil through no fault of his own. For the most part, I'd argue that villains written today are stronger characters than their older counterparts. It is far more realistic and far more compelling for the audience to be shown a bad guy who is complex, with their own redeeming qualities, their own strengths, their own version of nobility. Lastly, I think our new evolved, more complicated villain could be seen as realistic because at one point or another, we've all been that guy. I mean, I've never tried to wipe out half the galaxy, but I've said things that hurt people's feelings. I haven't been there for my family or friends in ways that would have meant a lot to them. I've taken insult from another's words when it's really just my own self-esteem issues playing with my feelings. I believe this is another reason that many audience members love seeing redemption stories, and love when a villain is humanized to the point of achieving audience empathy.
The greatest teacher failure is.
We all fail in small ways every single day. I think without realizing it, deep down, we secretly see ourselves as the villains of our own story. We are Kylo Ren, knowing we've made a terrible decision and desperately searching for redemption. We only see our flaws, only remember our mistakes. We look in the mirror and only see the villain. And we wonder if everyone else can see it too. As storytelling has evolved, audiences naturally find themselves wanting more from these characters. We realize that our experiences shape who we are, and realistic villains are in fact as three-dimensional as the heroes they face. Each of us has many, many things to be proud of, and yet we, unfortunately, tend to focus on the mistakes we most regret. We instinctively refuse to accept responsibility for our failures and try to pass the blame on to others, so as not to feed that inner villain we catch glimpses of in the looking glass. We are obsessed with humanizing the villain and obsessed with redemption because we are all hurting in our own ways, seeking our individual versions of salvation. I think the most important thing we can take away from this video is simply understanding. Understanding that it's okay to feel vulnerable, that it's not a sin to admit you were wrong and change your mind. Your reflection does not reveal your failure. You don't need to live another decade before finding out how tasty sushi really is. And we can learn to appreciate the complexity that is unraveled when Star Wars decides to humanize yet another unredeemable villain. Thanks for watching, everyone, and I'll see you next time.